Hi everyone, welcome to HR Works, brought to you by BLR. I'm your host, Steve Bruce. HR Works provides clear, relevant, actionable information on topics that matter to HR professionals. When you're armed with best practices and strategies to attract, retain, and engage top talent and deliver exceptional value to your organization, HR works. So there's no shortage of reminders these days that harassment is still a major issue for employers. And it's particularly challenging when, as we've seen all too often lately in the news, when an executive is a harasser or when a company culture implicitly condones or perpetuates sexual harassment or a hostile work environment. So what can HR managers do? We've invited employment law attorney Mark Schickman to help us wrangle with this challenge. And I'll just note that this is one of our series of podcasts being recorded live at BLR's Advanced Employment Issues Symposium in Las Vegas, where Mark, a partner at Freeland Cooper and Foreman LLP in San Francisco, just presented to an audience of HR professionals on the topic of the link between company culture and harassment claims. Mark has been practicing employment and labor law for 40 years. He has successfully litigated almost every type of employment case. He provides employment advice to employers across the country. He speaks and writes on litigation and employment law nationally. And Mark is a member of the American Arbitration Association's select panel of employment law arbitrators and is the editor of BLR's California Employment Law Letter. Mark, welcome to HR Works.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So, in recent years, the EEOC says the number of private sector charges, including harassment claims, rose significantly and accounted for more than 30% of all charges filed. So, do you have any reasons why we've seen such a significant increase in these types of claims?
Well, sex harassment and sex discrimination has always been one of the highest categories of EEOC charges. And it's always kept a very high percentage. On an absolute level, the number of charges have increased significantly this year. And I think that there's at least two different bases for it. There are a number of charges that used to be categorized as dealing with gender orientation, which are now being characterized as being harassment, sex harassment claims. So that's one of the reasons. And I think we're seeing more empowerment for people to come forward. This operates in cycles. And as I say, the number of charges themselves has remained at a high level in terms of the percentage of which is the highest category. I mean, just by way of example, following 9/11, you saw a huge spike with regard to national origin discrimination charges. So it reflects what's happening in society generally when you see it, and this is a year that's had a lot of activity with regard to sexual harassment.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for that. So what are some of the symptoms of a workplace culture that should raise a yellow flag or maybe a red flag for HR that harassment is practiced at a company or tolerated?
So, first of all, I think that an HR professional, the HR organization, needs to really go around and have its finger on the pulse of what is happening on the workplace floor. There's a whole lot that you will be able to figure out if you just keep your eyes open in terms of what is going on, in terms of whether there are red flags, number one. Number two, if you do see executives who engage in harassing behavior, you can be pretty sure that that's flowing to middle-level managers and it's flowing to supervisors. It's just the natural state of things that you see a great deal. So if you get pushback from your organization that charges of harassment should not be taken seriously, I think that it is a major red flag. Most people know what the rules are, and most people try to put those rules into place, and they try to obtain perform. So setting up the rules is not so hard. It's the administration of it that you really need to look at, because that's difficult.
Can you give some recent examples, maybe, of businesses whose aggressive business practices may have fostered a culture that ultimately led to harassment claims?
Sure. And again, I think that it's really obvious if you look at it. There's a company called American Apparel, which had a CEO named Dov Charney, and he went on 60 Minutes TV talking about how clothes are sexy, and his organization is therefore a sexy organization. It's known that this is somebody, and remember, this was before they fell because of this, an extremely popular, extremely successful organization. Dov Charney would come to board meetings wearing Speedos. It was known within the company that he's dating women within the company, claiming that it was a culture that would foster the kind of high fashion that he wants to put together. Simultaneously, when the company's finances slipped a little bit, the board turned on Dov Charney and got him out of there. And the members of the board that represented the banks and the financiers kicked Charney out. American Apparel is no more. It fell completely because of this. So you see lots of examples of this out there, which shouldn't be surprising. I'll talk a little bit about Fox News, which really the start of this. Recently, everybody's talking about Harvey Weinstein, but it really started with Fox News, and it started with Gretchen Carlson taking aim at Roger Ailes, and once that occurred, everything started falling out of after that, and you had the head of their sports division being pulled out of his office. Their biggest anchor was Bill O'Reilly, and when you look at the notion of, is there anybody too big to fall, you would think it would be Bill O'Reilly. His ratings were not only great, but he was the anchor for everything on that lineup, and he couldn't survive the pressure. So there are lots of external factors that are making this almost a public sport now. So those are two companies that you can look at that are pretty stark.
Well, with this recent flood of accusations against top-level executives, it's particularly in the entertainment industry. So what's behind this wave?
Well, if you look at the entertainment industry, since 1931, the Merriam-Webster dictionary had something called the casting couch. So that's been a term in American parlance since 1931. So nobody ought to be surprised that you've got casting couches in the entertainment industry, because everybody there is so popular, and we as a nation care so much about gossip of the same people that we read about when they have children in divorces in People magazine. Now we're reading about sexual harassment there. So that's why we are looking at this industry, and some of the examples actually are going all over the map. This will identify the date of this particular broadcast. This morning, Al Franken, the really a liberal standard bearer, a 2003 photograph of him, jokingly he says, putting his hands on the breast of a sleeping co-entertainer at a USO show. That photo showed up today, and the Senate Ethics Committee is going to start looking at him. So the reason that we're hearing about this so much from, you name it, from him, from movie stars, from Weinstein, is because there's the public interest in names that we know. But make no mistake about it, the exact same thing is happening at the grocery chain that has got executives, and the question is who's going to be assigned as a woman, who's going to be assigned as a manager in a given branch, and there are sexual predator managers in that industry, and in the hotel industry, and in the manufacturing industry, and in the service industry. So we're seeing it in the entertainment industry because they're names that we know and recognize, but again, this is everywhere. And the obligation to train about sexual harassment has been on the books since 1964. The rules are not hard. Keep your hands off of other people. It's just the rules are not hard, and people aren't getting it. So Steve, we're hearing about in the entertainment industry. I don't think it's either limited or really concentrated there.
All right, let's talk a little bit about what HR managers could do. So if you're an HR manager and you find that words and actions of one of your top executives is jeopardizing your goal of a workplace culture that's free of harassment, what can you do other than look for a new job?
Well, so first, it's really important when we identify workplace harassment, we're talking about more than what's been hitting the headlines recently, which is really sexual assault, more than it's sexual harassment. So the question is, so you're looking around. Usually, the signs that you will see are not of these assaults, but the signs that you will see is executives. You see that there's an executive who is dating a subordinate. You will see that there is an executive who, when typically he, but it could be a she as well, when they are going out to meetings, are only bringing members of the same gender with them, and are ignoring members of the other gender when they come with them. When the HR manager sees that, in order to do their job, they need to remedy the harassment at the top. Because if harassment is allowed to exist and thrive visibly at the top, the managers beneath that see it, and they will model it. They're already predisposed to model it because that has been kind of the social pattern for centuries, and so they will. So if you don't stop it at the top, it's not going to go away. So the first question that the HR manager needs to identify is are they empowered to do that? If they're not empowered to do that, they're not going to be able to really do the job. It's just a necessary step. How do you do it? Of course, you try to do it in a wise kind of way, where first you go to that. First, maybe you go to that executive privately and say, we've got an issue over here, and we need to remedy the issue. It's probably an error to kind of publicly call a top executive out. You've got to be a little bit wiser about that. And I think that you've got to set up a culture that protects you when you are doing that. How do you accomplish that? It can be very difficult. One of the tools that sometimes people use is bringing in outside people. Ordinarily, an HR department will want to have the ability to investigate, make a finding, and remedy. So you need to have the whole package. You need to have policies. You need to have a manner in which people can report and complain to you. You have to have an investigative mechanism, and you have to have a mechanism to remedy it. If the alleged perpetrator is just too highly placed for an HR manager to touch, this is a place where maybe you bring in somebody from the outside investigator, and you've got a choice then too. If you bring out an attorney to do it, then you've got the choice that you can make later as to whether it's going to be a privileged, confidential investigation or whether it's an open investigation. Because look, if it's your CEO who's engaging in this kind of behavior, the organization is going to have to figure out how it's going to deal with it. Is it going to deal with it publicly or privately? But somehow it is going to have to deal with it. So sometimes if you don't have other political cover, you go to the outside to do it. It's become much more significant now because sexual harassment and reviewing sexual harassment has become a public sport. And I want to say that there are pressures in both directions. Let me give you an example. There's Dean Chaudhry at University of California Bolt School of Law, Dean of the School of Law, who made $437,000 a year. That's his salary. So his habit was to hug his assistant. He says a couple of times a week, she says every day. And he says, this was my way of just showing how much I appreciated her. And she never complained. When she finally did complain, she went to HR and she said, I felt like a prisoner every day when this was happening to me. I felt powerless to stop him. How could I stop the dean of the law school from hugging me? So he makes the complaint. And it's investigated. And this is the discipline that was given to Chaudhry. 1, he had to apologize to her. 2, he had to take harassment training. And 3, he had to give up 10% of his salary, $43,700. So if you look at the technical rules, that a response to a harassment complaint has got to be reasonably calculated to prevent the behavior from occurring in the future. That's really the test. That's what you're trying to do. And today we're hearing all of these people calling for folks' head and punishment. Punishment really is not the issue. Deterrence and remedy is really where it was. So that's what happened to Chaudhry. Cost him $43,700. Looking at it from the outside, I think that that's a pretty heavy slap, right? Well, that was a remedy that was imposed in July. About 8 months later, in March, his assistant filed a lawsuit in Alameda County Superior Court. News of that went to the campus. All of a sudden, there were demonstrations around the law school. And faced with that kind of pressure, the university took Chaudhry out of his deanship and ultimately took him out of the faculty within a year. And for what it's worth, Chaudhry sued the university at that point, claiming, Caucasian managers, you don't discipline this way. Because I'm from India, you're disciplining me. So 2 lawsuits going on, which the university settles with both of them. What's the point I'm trying to get at? That there are pressures on both sides. There's pressure within the organization for the HR person not to do the right thing and maybe bury the harassment. And there's pressure from outside the organization where even after HR has done what it thinks is right, what is the professional thing to do, there's pressure for HR to do more. And I think in both instances, it's the job of HR to figure out what's the remedy that's going to prevent harassment in your organization and see that it doesn't happen again. Not being pressured by executives in the company, not being pressured by the crowd on the street. And because of those dual pressures, it's very hard on HR now.
Very hard.
Hi everyone, this is Chris Soplensky, the producer of HR Works. In just a moment, we'll continue with the second half of our interview with Mark. I just wanted to quickly tell you about BLR's 2018 HR Comply Conference, the new name for AEIS, the nation's leading human capital management conference for HR professionals, executives, and in-house counsel. HR Comply will be held November 14 through 16 at the Paris Hotel in Las Vegas. The superior content and expert presenters will help you get ahead of workplace policy updates with a one-stop, all-bases-covered overview of breaking updates and proven best practices. Learn more about HR Comply or reserve your seat now at live.blr.com/events. Now, back to Steve and Mark.
Now, the EEOC, they have this select task force on the study of harassment in the workplace, and I think they came out with some help, or they thought it was help. Can you talk about that?
Sure. At first when I looked at that task force, I was a little bit skeptical of it because it had all of the hallmarks of a high school play in its way. It did not seem like it was a serious product when you look at it, but some of their recommendations at the end I think are very useful. As I said, I've done 100 harassment trainings, and people ought to get it after the first time, and people still don't get it. So this task force is trying to identify what to do about that. And so it is looking at sexual harassment in the workplace and adopting some of the remedies that we're getting in the bullying kind of situation. The focus not being on managers or on harassers to stop their behavior, but the focus going on employees generally to stand up to this and kind of, if you see something, say something kind of approach, and empowering rank and file employees and letting those rank and file employees that know that they play a role. Because that's really what's different right now, that there are, none of this behavior is new. It really wasn't all that hidden. When people talk about this being, Weinstein being the best kept secret in Hollywood, of course that's an oxymoron. It was, worst kept secret, best kept secret, either way, it's not true. There were, it was pointed out that on an award show in 2013, the host turned to five of the five nominees and say, "Congratulations, you don't have to worry about Harvey Weinstein anymore." This is 5 years ago. People knew about it, and there are other examples of that coming out. So up until now, the focus has been on HR professionals, on managers, and trying to direct to perpetrators to change their behaviors. Now, this task force is recommending going beyond that, so that general employees know that it's part of their job too. And they've got this new initiative. It's called the "It's on Us" program. So again, it sounds a little bit hokey in its own kind of way, and it doesn't sound quite as serious as a task force ought to be. But we need something to make this effective, because again, these trainings are, it's pretty obvious especially what these sexual assaults are. When you look about sexual harassment per se, remember, it's not always about sexual desire. In fact, it probably is not usually about sexual desire. It's oftentimes about sexual antipathy. But in all of these instances, the managers know what's going on, the perpetrator knows what's going on, the victim knows what's going on. It's time to widen the circle, says this task force, to the other employees to know what's going on, and maybe we can stop it.
All right, thanks. Now, you've mentioned harassment and assault a couple of times. Can you clarify for us what the distinction is?
Sure. So first of all, a threat of a touching is an assault, and a touching is a battery. So let me just say that that's a little bit Law 101. So what we are hearing about making sexual advances with a threat that you won't get the next part, you won't get the next job if you don't succumb. Examples I used to give is a manager who goes to a subordinate and says, "I've got 2 annual reviews for you. I got this medium one I can give you now, or this excellent one that I'll give you in my hotel room if you want to come up." These are classic examples of what's called quid pro quo harassment. This for that harassment. And so when we think about this whole notion that you will allow me to have my way with you with sexual touching, which is an assault, right? If if you do, there's a reward for you in the workplace. That's what I'm talking about as an assault. On the other hand, If you've got a workplace where anytime a woman comes on the production floor, all the guys are going to tell the raunchiest jokes they know in order to gross that woman out. That's an example of sexual harassment. Somebody having nude pictures on their wall, so that when somebody needs to come in and talk to the supervisors, they've got to see a Playboy photo, or somebody a busty bikini-clad babe on the wall behind them. These are examples of harassment. I know that a woman knows that every time they're going to pass a certain supervisor, that supervisor is going to make some kind of sexual crack about them. And because of that, this woman is not going to walk that corridor if they see that guy over there. They are going to go the long way around the building in order to get where they want to go, because they don't want to be confronted that way. Harassment, because it creates a pervasive attitude, not assault. Every time a woman passes by, a guy is going to stand up and block the pathway, so that she's got to brush up against him, or kind of slither out of his way. These are all examples of harassment. It has to be a serious harassment or a pervasive harassment. So again, we've got to be logical about this. Saying to a woman once, man, that's a great dress, is fine. If you do it every single day, so Monday, that's a great dress. Tuesday, man, you look great in those shoes. Wednesday, you ought to wear high heels more. You look wonderful in them. Thursday, you smell great today. Any one of those comments once in a month, probably okay. Doing it every day becomes pervasive harassment. And if you look at what's really going on, there's a great deal more of that harassment in the workplace than there is the sexual assault type. So that's why I say we need to keep that distinction clear, especially looking at what's going on in the news today, where everything that we're hearing about as sexual harassment is really a sexual assault. The photo of Al Franken as a joke, putting his hands on the breast of a sleeping coworker and taking a picture of that, it's an assault. He's got no business putting his hands on somebody else's breast. So hard to make it more straightforward than that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Now, if HR wanted to do an audit of the company practices or some kind of survey to see about the harassment, what steps would you recommend? And again, should they involve an attorney?
So the danger over here is, in the absence of having an attorney involved, what you discover and what you find, you might have to produce it in a later lawsuit. So a company does this kind of audit, finds out that 25% of the women there think that they have been harassed. The next month, one woman brings a harassment claim, and it's in court. So they say, okay, you did a study. Give me the study. So there's a danger there. If the company has got to produce, did you know that 25% of your workforce claims they were harassed? Yes, I did. And legally, that might not come in otherwise. There's a term we've heard about, this hashtag, this Me Too harassment. And legally in court, only certain Me Too harassment will be allowed into evidence, right? So if you've got a manager at a hotel chain in San Francisco who claims that they were harassed, and there's a manager of that same hotel chain in Atlanta who says, I was harassed too, that Atlanta evidence might not necessarily come in. the San Francisco plaintiff is going to have to first prove that the same people were involved, that it was part of a pattern. So Me Too, the way the parlance is really laid out right now, is not what is the legal notion out there, but it's a pretty serious issue as we are looking at it, and HR needs to try to remedy this any chance that they can get.
All right. So you've advised, you've arbitrated, you've defended many cases involving harassment. What are the biggest and costliest mistakes that HR makes?
So I think that the first one is not getting the information that they need. So you will oftentimes see an instance that a complaint of harassment stops at the first line supervisor level. HR doesn't find out about it until there's 3 or 4 different complaints, and now HR can't deal with it. So one of the things that HR needs to do is to make sure that the supervisors and managers know that they need to report any complaints of harassment over to HR. HR can decide to deal with it or not to deal with it, but only HR is going to know whether the alleged perpetrator under a different supervisor a year before had the same kinds of complaints, and under a different supervisor a year before, same kind of complaint. So each of these supervisors thinks that it's just a one-time deal. There's got to be somebody central who knows otherwise. That's number one. Number two, you need to set up a reporting system that is going to be welcome by employees. If you've got a reporting system and you find out that employees are not comfortable using it because there's a fear of retaliation, then your reporting system will go absolutely nowhere. And I often say that somebody might accidentally engage in discrimination. You don't accidentally engage in retaliation. And so retaliation is one of the few places where when I give recommendations and when I give trainings to companies, I'll often say this is the one area where if anybody asks my recommendation and I find out that you retaliated against somebody, I'm going to say terminate. Because again, maybe you didn't understand that this glamour photo that you made of your wife in a very sultry, seductive pose that you have on your desk, you may not understand that that's viewed to be a harassing photo. You think it's your favorite picture of your wife. And so now that there's a complaint, and now you understand it offends people, so take it down, and I'm willing to accept that, company willing to accept that as a mistake. If you then target the people who made the complaint against you and retaliate against them, a whole slew of things is going to happen. First of all, that's intentional conduct. Companies got very little by way of defense, number one. Number two, if the company allows that kind of retaliation to come up, nobody is ever going to complain to HR again. They're going to go straight to the EEOC, and that's not what you want to have done. So you want to have a complaint process that's open that way. You have to have an investigation process that the victim feels, the alleged victim, feels comfortable in pursuing. And then at the end, you got to close the loop. This is what's hard. For a lot of companies, in fact, take a complaint and they take the complaint seriously and they investigate it and they impose some discipline, but they never go back to the complainant. And they never tell the complainant what's going on. So the complainant thinks that they've made a complaint of harassment and it just fell under deaf ears. So you've done everything right except close the loop. So I think that kind of holistic system is what is important for an HR professional to put into place.
Mark, this is all great, very helpful. Any final recommendations for HR to sum this all up?
Well, just that life is going to become more difficult. The newest guidelines, not the task force, but the newest EEOC guidelines are becoming more aggressive in saying that gender identity and transgender identity is a form of sex discrimination and sex harassment, which is prohibited by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In other words, when you discriminate against a transgender person, you're basically saying that's a guy and he ought to be behaving like a guy, or that's a woman and she should be behaving like a woman. So you really are engaging in the discrimination or harassment on the basis of gender, says the EEOC. So you've got to kind of broaden your thinking, and it's difficult to get your head around that. It's difficult having your lead salesperson Jack leave work on Friday wearing a suit and tie, and he becomes becomes Jacqueline, and shows up after a 2-week vacation wearing a dress, hose, and heels. And you have to be able to accept that the way we have been able to accept lots of other things in the workplace over the last 50 years, where at the beginning we were going to say it wasn't going to happen. We also have twin trends that are going on where there's a lot more discussion of sex and sexuality in the office. So you are seeing a lot more of the kind of discussion at work that you're going to try to monitor, and at the same time, you've got this public sense that the workplace has got to be 100% clean when it comes to not engaging in sexual harassment. So we're becoming looser in some ways and more puritanical in other ways, and HR is standing in the middle, trying to withstand being buffeted by these opposing forces. So thank God that there's HR people out there. I sometimes feel that we are the honest brokers for society. So kudos to all of you who are listening to this.
Well, thank God also that we've got good advice coming from our employment attorneys. Thanks so much for joining us, Mark. We appreciate these insights.
Thank you.
So listeners, please let me know what HR Works should cover next. sbruce@blr.com. Thanks for listening. This is Steve Bruce for HR Works.